Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're taking a deep dive into the world of gray zone tactics. And wow, you sent us a ton of stuff to dig through on this. Looks like you really want to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah.
And honestly, so do we.
Yeah, it's a good idea to wrap your head around this stuff. It feels like gray zone tactics are, well, everywhere these days.
All right, so
Yeah.
picture this. There's a country out there, and they're kind of subtly messing with another country's energy supply. Or maybe they're using social media to spread fake news during an election. That's the gray zone we're talking about. It's this weird in-between space where it's not exactly war, but it's definitely not peace either.
It really is like, well, it's like playing chess, but the rules are always changing, and the other player is making moves that, well, you don't even realize are part of the game at first. But that's the point, right? It's all about being ambiguous. It lets countries or, whoever get what they want without starting a huge war, which obviously no one really wants.
So it's like they're exploiting a loophole, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And it all happens so gradual. It's like a vine, a slow-growing vine. You barely notice it at first, but then the next thing you know, it's wrapped around everything and choking the life out of it. The effects can be just as bad as a war, but it's so much slower and harder to, pin down exactly what's happening.
And I'm guessing it doesn't just stick to one area either. Right?
Nope. And that's one of the trickiest parts. Gray zone tactics, they can pop up anywhere. Politics, the economy, even culture. The point is to weaken a country, make it less stable and less resilient so it's easier to manipulate down the road.
You know what? One of the things you sent, a paper by Dr. Maria Sanchez, she makes this comparison to the Cold War, which I thought was really interesting. She points out how the U.S. and the Soviet Union, they were always doing these shady things back then. Covert ops, propaganda, supporting different sides in other conflicts. It was all this maneuvering for power, but without ever actually attacking each other directly.
And that's a classic example. It just goes to show that these tactics, they've been around forever. But what's changed is, well, technology. Think about it. The internet, social media, cyberattacks, all that makes these tactics way more powerful and harder to defend against.
It does feel like we're constantly playing catch up. Just think about deep fakes, right? It's getting harder and harder to know what's real and what's totally made up.
Absolutely. It makes you question everything you see and hear. And that's the goal, or part of it anyway, to create this world where no one knows what to believe, where everyone's suspicious. It makes it so much easier to manipulate people and just, well, cause chaos. Actually, one of the things you sent talks about a fake video, like a deep fake, of a politician saying all this crazy stuff. They spread it online right before an election, and people believed it. Later on, it turned out to be totally fake, but the damage was already done.
That's scary. It shows how these tactics can mess up entire elections. And it's not just elections either, right? It can affect, well, pretty much anything, from public health to national security.
Exactly. Like, imagine a country's trying to get a good trade deal, right? Instead of just negotiating like normal, they might launch a bunch of cyber attacks to shut down the other country's infrastructure, their power grids and stuff. That forces them to make concessions. It's basically coercion, but it's all done online, so it's super hard to trace back to who did it.
So we're talking about a world where it's really blurry, like what's war and what's peace. And the rules are totally different. And the fighting can happen anywhere, online, or even by messing with things like the power grid.
Yeah, and that's what makes gray zone tactics so difficult to deal with. It's like they're exploiting all the gaps in how we think about conflict. We need totally new ways of defending ourselves and deterring this kind of stuff.
It does feel like we've entered this totally new world of how countries compete with each other. Where the real battles are fought with code and stories and stuff, not just on a battlefield with tanks and soldiers and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the tools and tricks that they use in this gray zone. It's like learning to spot a pickpocket. Once you know what to look for, you're way less likely to get your wallet stolen.
So, okay, let's get into that then. What are some of the most common tactics they're using out there right now?
One that's getting really popular is economic manipulation, basically using money to get political influence. Like that old saying, follow the money. Well, in this case, the money is the weapon, They use it to try to chip away at another country's independence.
Oh, I see what you mean. One of the reports you sent, I think it was from CSIS, they talk about how China's been doing this thing called debt trap diplomacy, mostly in Africa. They give these huge loans for infrastructure projects, but there are all these conditions that come with the money. Then, when the countries can't pay back the loans, China demands stuff in return, access to important resources or votes in the UN or something. It's sneaky, but it works really well.
It is. It's a perfect example of how they use economic power to get what they want without ever having to go to war. And it's not just loans either. Think about supply chains, you know? Like during the pandemic, everyone saw how fragile the global supply chains are. If there's a disruption, it can wreck entire economies. And countries can use that, exploit that vulnerability, you know?
It's kind of terrifying when you think about it. Imagine a country, let's say they've got a monopoly on some rare earth metal that's super important for making, I don't know, smartphones or something. Then they just suddenly stop selling it to another country. It could destroy their whole tech industry, and they never even had to fire a single bullet.
Exactly. It's about wielding that economic power in a smart way, you know? Make other countries dependent on you and then use that leverage to get what you want or to weaken your rivals.
And then there's the whole world of information warfare where, well, it feels like nothing is real anymore. Perception becomes reality, and I don't know, truth doesn't even seem to matter.
Yeah, that's where things get really messy. One of the articles you shared, it was about how Russia used all these troll farms online to spread fake news and propaganda during the 2016 US presidential election. The crazy part is it wasn't even about getting one candidate elected over another. It was about messing with the whole system, making people lose trust in democracy.
So they were basically turning social media into a weapon, right?
Yeah.
To manipulate how people think, make them more divided, and just create this environment where no one trusts anything anymore.
Exactly. And it worked. We're still seeing the consequences of that today. There are still a lot of people who think the election was rigged and they don't trust the media at all anymore. It's a textbook example of how disinformation can, like, rot away the foundations of democracy.
So what can we even do about this? How do we defend ourselves when we can't even tell what's real and what's fake anymore?
It's a tough one, but I think education is a big part of it. We need to give people the tools to be critical of the information they're getting, to spot propaganda and to recognize when someone's trying to manipulate them. It's kind of like teaching someone how to tell if a $100 bill is fake, you know?
That's a good analogy. Media literacy is more important than ever. We need to be able to figure out what sources we can trust, be skeptical about everything we see and hear, and just, well, think for ourselves.
Yeah. But it's not all on individuals either. Governments and the big tech companies need to step up too. We need stronger rules to stop the spread of fake news, more transparency from those social media platforms, and we need to invest more in fact-checking and debunking all this misinformation that's floating around out there.
So it's kind of like we need to build an immune system for the digital world, right? To protect us from all these invisible threats.
That's a really good way to put it. And just like a real immune system, it has to constantly be adapting. The people using these tactics, they're always coming up with new ways to do it, so we need to stay ahead of them. We need to be able to anticipate what they'll do next and develop new ways to fight back.
Speaking of new threats, something that's really worrying me is how technology is being used for surveillance and, controlling people. One of the things you sent, a report from Human Rights Group, it talked about how some governments are using facial recognition and AI to track their citizens, see what you're doing online, and basically silence anyone who disagrees with them.
It's pretty scary when you think about it. All this technology, it has so much potential to do good, but in the wrong hands, it can be incredibly dangerous. We need to have some serious conversations about ethics, privacy, and, well, just making sure we don't end up living in a dystopian nightmare.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? We want to benefit from all the cool things technology can do, but we don't want to give up our basic freedoms. It's like, I don't know, trying to tame a wild animal or something. You have to be strong and in control, but you also can't provoke it too much.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why international cooperation is so important here. Countries need to work together to create some global rules for this stuff, share best practices and hold each other accountable. If we don't, this technology could really hurt democracy and human rights all over the world.
So we've covered economic manipulation, disinformation, and surveillance. But, what's the impact of all this? How is it actually affecting things on the ground?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is how all this is destabilizing political systems and institutions. Gray zone tactics, they thrive in chaos and division.
Yeah, and a lot of your sources, especially the ones about Eastern Europe, they talk about that a lot. They point out how Russia's been using all this stuff, disinformation, cyber attacks, economic pressure to weaken governments in places like Ukraine and Moldova. It makes those countries much more vulnerable to Russian influence.
It's almost like a slow motion coup, They chip away at a country's independence from the inside. They exploit the divisions that already exist, use propaganda to make people distrust their government, and then they come in and present themselves as the solution, like some kind of strongman who can bring back order.
It's the classic divide and conquer strategy, but for the 21st century.
Right. And it's not just politics either. This can affect everything from the economy to healthcare. Like, think about all the disinformation that was spread about COVID. It scared people, confused them, made them distrust public health officials, and it made the whole pandemic so much worse.
It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. These tactics, they exploit all our weaknesses, they make our fears worse, and they make it really hard for us to solve problems together.
And that's why it's so crucial that we understand what these tactics really are. They're a form of warfare, but it's being fought in the shadows. We have to be vigilant, we have to be informed, and we have to be proactive in defending ourselves, both individually and as a global community.
It's a tough spot to be in, isn't it? We're trying to stay ahead of the game, figure out what they'll do next, but we also don't want to do the same things they're doing. We have to stick to our principles, right?
Oh, yeah, it's a real balancing act. And one of the toughest things is figuring out how to respond. If you react too strongly, you could make things worse, even play right into their hands. But if you don't do anything, well, they think you're weak, and they'll just keep pushing further.
It's almost like they're holding a mirror up to us, showing us all the cracks in our systems, all the weaknesses we might not even realize we have. There was this report you sent from some European think tank, and it talked about how we rely on all these complex systems now. The global financial system, the internet, everything's connected. And that creates all these new vulnerabilities that they can exploit.
It is. It's like we've built this giant, intricate house of cards, and they're over there figuring out how to pull out a card here and there without making the whole thing collapse, at least not right away.
So, okay, how do we make our house of cards a little more, well, sturdy? How can we counter these tactics without, accidentally making things escalate?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. There's no quick fix for this. It's about building up our resilience over time. One of the books you sent, I think it was written by a former intelligence officer, he made this analogy about a garden. You have to constantly tend to it, right? Pull out the weeds, take care of the plants, make sure the soil is good. You can't just ignore it and expect it to thrive.
So it's more about winning a bunch of small battles, not one big one, and making ourselves less vulnerable so these little attacks don't work as well.
That's it. And it takes a multi-pronged approach. One of the key things is we need to strengthen our institutions, make our democracies more robust. That means securing our elections, protecting freedom of the press, things like that. Make sure the rule of law is strong.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A strong democracy where people are informed and participate in the process, that's way harder to manipulate and spread disinformation in, right?
Exactly. Another really important part is international cooperation. No one can fight this alone. We need to work together, set some global standards, share what we know, and coordinate our responses. Actually, a lot of the stuff you sent talked about the importance of alliances for this, like NATO, for example. They've been shifting their focus to address these hybrid threats, the gray zone stuff, because they're realizing that the old ways of doing things, just focusing on traditional warfare, that's not enough anymore.
It's like that old saying, united we stand, divided we fall. It feels more relevant than ever now.
Absolutely. And it's not just about governments and organizations like NATO either. Businesses, civil society groups, even just regular people, we all have a part to play in this.
That's true. We're all connected in this globalized world, so we all have a responsibility to protect it, right?
Right. Businesses need to be smarter about the risks and make sure their cybersecurity is up to par. Civil society, they can play a big role in monitoring what's going on, exposing these tactics when they see them. And individuals, well, we need to be more careful about the information we consume. Don't believe everything you see online. Think critically. And be aware of your own biases. We all have them.
So it's like we all need to understand the rules of the game and then learn how to play defense.
Right.
So we don't get played.
Yes, exactly. It's about being proactive, not waiting for something bad to happen and then reacting. We need to be thinking ahead, building up our defenses, and just making it clear that these tactics, they're not going to work.
Thinking about it like that actually makes me feel, well, kind of hopeful. Like we're not just pawns in this giant geopolitical chess game.
Yeah.
We can learn the moves, come up with our own strategies, maybe even change the rules of the game a little bit.
That's the spirit. And honestly, that's what I find so fascinating about this whole topic. It's definitely a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for us to rethink how we approach security, diplomacy, and just how countries interact with each other in this crazy, complicated world.
I have to say, this deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I've learned so much, and I have a much better understanding of this whole gray zone thing now.
Me too. And it's an important conversation to keep having. We need to keep learning, keep adapting, and keep working together to make the world a safer and more secure place.
I couldn't agree more. So to our listener, thank you so much for sending us all this stuff. Hopefully you feel like you've got a better handle on gray zone tactics now, not just how to spot them, but also, why people use them and how tricky it can be to respond to them.
And remember, the best defense is knowledge and being engaged. Keep asking questions, be curious, and never stop learning.
That's great advice. Until next time, everyone, stay safe, stay informed, and stay engaged. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.